It's Tuesday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster.
The next president of the United States, Donald J. Trump.
A rapturous welcome for Donald Trump 2 days after surviving an assassination attempt.
That was amazing. It was one of the best experiences. I had tears in my eyes, and I haven't cried like that since I lost my mother.
And this man is Donald Trump's pick for vice president. What does it mean for the special relationship? Wales's First Minister resigns after 4 of his ministers quit. We have the latest from Cardiff. Also today, is the new Labour government going to put up thousands of new pylons as part of its energy plans?
We will have the grid we need to rewire our country. Friends, power for Britain, wealth for Britain, jobs for Britain. That's the new Britain we can build together.
And the government faces more calls to end the 2-child benefits cap. Will ministers listen?
I accept that people are frustrated around the 2-child cap. They're frustrated over 14 years. We've had 14 years of the Tories who have put us on the highest tax burden.
Joining us today, Labour MP Preet Gill, Conservative MP Luke Evans, Green MP and party co-leader Carla Denyer, and Henry Hill of Conservative Home. This is Politics Live. Welcome. Well, we've had some dramatic news politically because Labour's First Minister in Wales, Vaughan Gething, has resigned. Let's go straight to Cardiff and talk to our correspondent there, Cemlyn Davis. Hello to you, Cemlyn. Why has he quit?
Yes, as you say, a dramatic day, another dramatic day here in Cardiff Bay. We've had many of them since Vaughan Gething took over as Welsh Labour leader exactly 4 months ago to the day, and subsequently First Minister. And now we've had this statement from him saying that he's taking the difficult decision to begin the process of stepping down as leader of the Welsh Labour Party and, as a result, First Minister. Now, this comes after months of very difficult headlines and questions for the First Minister. He's been under pressure since day one, really, because of his decision initially to accept controversial donations to his leadership campaign. Then there was a row over his decision to sack one of his ministers, Hannah Blythin. He accused her of leaking text messages that he had written back in 2020, something that she later emphatically denied. That then led to Plaid Cymru pulling out of the cooperation agreement that it had with Labour here in the Senedd, and that has made Vaughan Gething and the Welsh Labour government's position very tricky here in recent weeks, finding it difficult to get things through, difficult to win votes. And in fact, you'll remember Vaughan Gething himself lost a vote of no confidence just a few weeks ago. And then this morning, dramatic developments as 4 senior members of his cabinet, within minutes of each other, sent their resignation letters to him, saying that they couldn't carry on if he was carrying on as leader, and calling on him to resign. So that's really the final straw here, leading to Vaughan Gething's statement within the last hour. Now, he says it's been the privilege and honour of his life to do this job, even for a few short months. He also then, it's quite a bullish statement, he goes on to say that at no point during his ministerial career has he ever done anything for personal gain, and he believes that some of the criticism levelled towards him over the past few months have been unjust and politically motivated. But here we are, 4 months on from his victory, taking over as Welsh Labour leader, the party now beginning its search for a new leader.
Right, and what sort of timeline are we talking about, Cemlyn?
Well, that detail hasn't been provided as of yet. We haven't heard from the First Minister directly. He has done a pool clip, we understand, but he hasn't spoken directly to us at BBC Wales. What we are waiting to see now, of course, is whether he'll be appearing as scheduled for today's session of First Minister's Questions, which will be taking place, or is due to take place, at 1:30. It was supposed to be the final First Minister's Questions of this Senedd term before MS's break up for summer. And in fact, in his statement, Vaughan Gething says that he had hoped that that summer break would bring an opportunity for Welsh Labour to regroup after those difficult few months, but he now recognises that won't be possible.
Yes, Cemlyn Davies, thank you very much for joining us there from Cardiff with that rather important news that the First Minister, Vaughan Gething, has quit. Preet, only a month ago, if we show you this headline here from BBC News, Keir Starmer has confidence in First Minister despite vote loss, that being the vote of confidence that had already taken place. He didn't go then. Was it an error of judgment to support him?
Look, I think it's important. The Welsh people voted for a Labour government. We've got the most amount of MPs. This is a moving picture. Vaughan has resigned. He will now be transitioning until a leader can be identified.
But my question is about whether it was an error of judgment of Keir Starmer campaigning during the election to be Prime Minister and have a Labour government to support a First Minister in Vaughan Gething who had already had serious questions in terms of donations and where they had come from, and then facing that vote of confidence which he lost.
Well, look, this is a matter for the Welsh Senate in terms of who they want to see as the person that they appoint.
Nothing to do with Labour Party anywhere else?
Well, look, no, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that, you know, he was there, he was appointed in a democratic way. Clearly, he's now resigned and, you know, they've got to have a fair process to find an alternative leader. But the Welsh people wanted a Labour government. We have the most amount of Labour MPs. The confidence with Keir Starmer is absolutely there.
He's done the right thing, hasn't he? Luke, you should welcome it. Vaughan Gething's gone.
Well, Gething and Gareth gone on the same day. I mean, you never thought you'd say that.
Gareth Southgate,
obviously. I mean, Starmer, I believe, visited there the day before the election in Carmarthenshire and stood and talked about the 14 years of chaos under the Conservative government. We're 14 days in, or not even quite, and already Wales is in chaos now, trying to find their next leader. But I think Gething, we've learnt from the hard experience when your ministers choose not to support your leader what that really means. We saw that happen to Hamza Yousaf as well. So clearly there is
Liz Truss, Boris Johnson.
Absolutely, the names go on. So it is difficult. He had to go, and I'm glad he's gone. And I hope Wales now will rethink and reshape of where they go next.
Carla?
Well, I think it's long overdue. The First Minister has been mired in controversy and scandal for some time, and unfortunately it left Wales without much of a functioning government over the first few months. I think, unfortunately, this is a symptom of the attitude that we've seen from Welsh Labour generally. They don't seem to respond well to scrutiny and perhaps take some of their voters in Wales for granted. So I see this as another sign that we need a bit more diversity of thoughts and fresh voices in the Senedd. And with the results we've just had in the general election, the Greens in Wales got a record-breaking vote share.
But you don't have any MSs, do you, in Senedd?
Not yet, but based on the record-breaking vote share we got in this general election, we think we could be on track for one in 2026.
This is an internal issue. I mean, it happens with lots of parties in lots of positions. Overwhelmingly, though, the Labour people, the Welsh people have, supported a Labour government, and we have the most amount of Labour MPs returned from Wales. So that actually does say that they, absolutely have confidence in Keir Starmer and the plan that we have for the country. So this is an internal issue. We've got to let them carry on with it. It's been a moving picture, and they will have a fair process to elect the next leader.
But there's no doubt that the Welsh Labour government has been mired in scandal and that it has distracted it from doing its job.
Well, I disagree with that. In what sense? Well, how has it?
Especially with what's going on with
Tata Steel. How has it been mired in scandal? We've talked about Vaughan Gething. How has the whole government been mired in scandal?
Well, what I'm hearing from my colleagues in Wales is that it is distracting the Welsh government from getting on with the job of governing.
That's not true, though, is it, Carla? I mean, you haven't got any Green MPs in Wales. We've just had an overwhelming result for Labour nationally.
Have councillors, though, who
the
have to deal with the Welsh
confidence from the
government.
Welsh people for Labour government speaks for itself in the return of the Labour MPs, and to suggest that somehow they haven't been delivering, that is absolutely incorrect.
Let's talk to Henry. How big a blow is this, and can it be seen more broadly in terms of consequences for the government at Westminster?
I think consequences for the government at Westminster will be relatively limited. I don't think there are that many Labour voters who are going to be thinking, oh, Vaughan Gething's gone. I'm regretting my Starmer vote. I am looking forward to Labour just deciding that the Tory leadership process is an internal event upon which people shouldn't comment. In terms of Wales...
That won't happen, by the way, just to reassure you.
Isn't that amazing? But it is an internal process and we need to elect and all the rest of it. I think the important thing for Labour in Wales is going to be what happens next, because the leadership contest itself was actually mired in controversy. There were allegations of attempts to stitch up trades union nominations against Jeremy Miles, who was the runner-up. Jeremy Miles himself is the Education Secretary and spent his entire campaign not mentioning education at all, because the Welsh Government's education record is terrible. So, yeah, Vaughan Gething's gone. Wales is mostly for his own failings, but Welsh Labour is in a slightly precarious position. It's been in power for a long time. It's dependent on Plaid Cymru, and as we saw at the leadership contest, it doesn't have a big bench of people able to take up and kind of put it back on an upward trajectory.
All right, well, let's turn our attention to what's been going on in America, because Donald Trump, as you may have seen, pictures of him at the National Convention, the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee. Here he is being greeted by supporters there just 2 days after surviving that assassination attempt. And here is the man, you can see at the centre of the screen, that he has picked as his running mate, J.D. Vance. We talked about him yesterday too. He's the senator from Ohio. And of course, it's also now that Donald Trump has been confirmed as the Republican official presidential nominee. Well, they are going to be working closely together. Interesting, because he has made J.D. Vance some pretty disobliging comments about Donald Trump in the past. Well, clearly time is a great healer, because he has been chosen to run with him. But let's just listen to something that J.D. Vance said about the UK last week.
I was talking with a friend recently, and we were talking about, one of the big dangers in the world, of course, is nuclear proliferation, though, of course, the Biden administration doesn't care about it. And I was talking about, what is the first truly Islamist country that will get a nuclear weapon? And we were like, maybe it's Iran. Maybe Pakistan already kind of counts. And then we sort of finally decided maybe it's actually the UK, since Labour just took over.
Well, that was J.D. Vance at the National Conservatism Conference in Washington last week. Yes, he was talking to, unsurprisingly, Conservatives in America and a few notable people here. We'll come on to that in just a moment. But, Preet, what's your reaction? It could be the person that you will be working with if they win, the Republicans.
Well, I'm really surprised. I mean, the United States is so diverse, just as Britain is, and that's one of our strengths. And, the Labour Party picked up votes from lots of communities, different communities. But, look, the United States is a really strong ally. It was a Republican event, and of course Labour has a very different stance in terms of how it sees all of our diverse communities. But as I say, these are not comments I recognise.
You don't recognise, meaning?
Meaning, I don't accept the comments in the way that they've been made, and especially levied towards the Labour Party. Like I say, the beauty of Britain is the strength of its diversity, the contribution that the Commonwealth and people from the diaspora have made to our country.
Yeah, what did you make of those comments?
For me, I mean, it's everything needs context, and the danger in our political circles is how we lose nuance and context. Social media drives that. It was poor taste for me. It seemed to joke from that basis. But, I mean, we have to be careful because Biden's been called over the coals for his bullseye comment. I mean, and we've now got a foreign secretary who in 2017 tweeted about how Donald Trump's a KKK sympathiser, neo-Nazi sympathiser. So we need to think very carefully about this. How that impacts on our relationships, well, we'll see. But actually, I think actions demonstrate more than words on that basis.
Right.
Well, we have a very strong working relationship with the US, so I hope it stays.
Right. Well, let's just show you the headline in the Eye. Starmer and Trump start building their new special relationship, taking everything you have just said into account. And as I said, J.D. Vance said something pretty. I think he said at one point that he was America's Hitler, Donald Trump. So things have clearly moved on. But how will it affect the special relationship if you are working with Donald Trump and J.D. Vance?
Well, look, David Lammy has already met with J.D. Vance twice.
So he's a friend.
Of course, because we don't know what the outcome of the election is going to be in the United States. Britain is really clear that we will work with our allies very, very closely, especially on issues of Ukraine and geopolitics more broadly. So this is a really important relationship.
Right, it's an important relationship. Do you think it's right that the Prime Minister is pursuing a much closer relationship with Donald Trump because he may be president again.
Well, firstly, I just want to come back briefly to the comments from JD Vance. I think we need to call that out for what it is. It's baldly Islamophobic comment, jokes, and I'm quite shocked and appalled that a senior politician would make comments like that. It's very worrying that the US could end up with a president who's a convicted criminal and a vice president who is more aligned with Russian foreign policy than with supporting Ukraine. Yes, of course, the UK will have to work with whoever is in charge in the US, but I really hope that the voters in the US, including some of my British friends as well who've got dual national citizenship, I know they'll be taking their votes extremely seriously.
Was it Islamophobic, what he said?
I mean, yeah, I think so. He obviously was joking, but the two things can be simultaneously true. I think for me that clip is a reminder of why British Conservatives should really just be careful about when they go over to address American gatherings.
Like Suella Braverman.
Yeah, right. Half the time when you get the most demented stuff coming out of their speeches, you read down to paragraph 3 and it's like addressing a gathering in the United States and you're like, oh. So they have a very different political culture that's considerably to the right of ours, and that is worth bearing in mind. I mean, I think the special relationship is sort of a fantasy by British policymakers, to be honest. I think if you really look at it in hard foreign policy terms, there's not that much
even
evidence
over
that
Ukraine,
we get
for
special
example.
treatment. No, we've stepped up and done that, but I don't think that's evidence of America giving us any special treatment.
Well, OK.
America has a special relationship. It's with the Republic of Ireland, but for us, it's an alliance that sometimes I think we overhype.
Do you think Suella Braverman was wrong, the former Home Secretary? She was, as Henry said, at that National Conservatism conference. Maybe people like JD Vance are fellow travellers then?
I have no idea. She's got the choice to make it. We all need to make relationships across, like David Lammy meeting him. Whether she's right or wrong, that's for her to decide. And if she thinks that's best serves her constituents, then, well, that's the best way she'll do it.
Right, well, let's pick up on something Carla was mentioning. In Politico here, Trump's VP, Vice President pick spells disaster for Europe and Ukraine. And that's because the Ohio Senator champions US isolationism and opposes aid for Ukraine. What will your message be?
Well, look, the NATO Secretary-General has already talked very positively about Ukraine possibly joining NATO and having a membership, you know. So I think it's really important that security is what the Prime Minister is focusing on. He's meeting EU leaders later on this week. And the United States does understand that the EU and the UK have got to have a very strong security pact, and possibly being a NATO ally means having constructive conversations with our US allies on issues that will be difficult, and they may have a different...
Well, it won't be just difficult. I mean, if it is Trump and JD Vance, that will upend that relationship that you have just described in NATO.
Look, our diplomacy and the importance of Britain playing its role as a really important ally, and I disagree with the comments made earlier about the things that we need to work together. If you think about climate, development, geopolitics, we have got to work more closely with our allies, and having those difficult conversations is part of that, and that we are not going to be shying away from those conversations. Clearly, meeting with EU leaders, as Keir will be doing this week,
so you're not worried?
Is so important.
You're not worried about a Trump-Vance presidency and vice presidency when it comes to the war in Ukraine?
Well, you know, David Lammy is going to have those conversations. We don't have the other side of that conversation about actually those attitudes shifting and changing, and how constructive diplomacy relationships can shift, the views of certain people prior to coming into running government in the United States.
How concerned would you be?
Well, I don't know, because you've seen Trump, one of the things he was castigated for was walking into NATO and telling them all off for not all meeting, and look where we are now. So he does seem
it's about defence spending, wasn't it, that they've got to do their bit?
Absolutely, to do their part. So there is that element, and the danger is, having a disaster put in inverted commas on that headline is exactly what I'm talking about, the nuance of the debate. It's being caged one way or the other. It doesn't allow that constructive conversation that we want to happen, because there are going to be differences of opinion and should be thought through, because at the end of the day, it is a lot of taxpayers' money to be given away. But I think it's the right thing to be doing.
Well, Carla, do you agree with Luke on that? Maybe it's time to have a more, how can I put it, open debate about things like the money that is being spent on the Ukraine war in terms of future relations. Donald Trump said at one point that if he became president, he could end this conflict. What's your thought?
I'm not sure the Greens really have any common ground with Donald Trump. I think it's important and it's right that the UK has supported Ukraine, and I think at this time it's imperative that David Lammy and the Labour government make sure that they're pursuing foreign policy that of course benefits the UK and that pursues long-term peace, and to make sure that the UK government doesn't just fall in line with whatever the next US government is doing.
Concerned?
Yeah, but I think it's important that Europe confronts the reality of what a more isolationist America might be. And Trump, for all his many downsides, he at least says honestly what many American voters think, which is that most of NATO does not meet the defence commitment. And it is frankly a bit embarrassing that all of Europe together needs American support to see off Russia, which has a GDP the size of Mexico's, because it just doesn't spend anything on defence. So absolutely, it is deeply worrying for Ukraine, because at the moment it is American treasure and armaments overwhelmingly that's keeping Ukraine in the fight. But that should not be the case. And if Europe is serious about being a defence cooperation agreement, it will mean hard decisions with an awful lot of electorates and spending a lot more money. And ideally, we should have been doing that yesterday. We should start doing it now.
Right. Well, I mean, there is a defence review being launched today by Keir Starmer and the Defence Secretary, John Healey. And it is a step towards what the government says is its ambition of hiking spending to 2.5% of our national income, spending that on defence. But they haven't given a date. Do they need to?
Well, I think, this review will hopefully report back early 2025. It's going to look at hollowing out of the armed forces under the Conservatives, the waste that has gone on in terms of, where they've spent some of the procurement money. So there's a lot of work to be done. It's not something that you can just suddenly sort of set out a timescale. We've got to grow the economy. We all know that. It would not be prudent of me to set a timescale as to when we're going to be able to reach that. We've got to allow this review to to take place. And then I'm sure we will set some timescales to that.
Right. I mean, do you accept that the armed forces, I mean, Preet's not the only person, there have been people within your own party that feel that the armed forces have been hollowed out under 14 years of Conservative power?
No. I've come from the PPS in defence, and we had that argument. We lost it. We wanted to, had a path to get to the 2.5% on that basis. I do worry that we're going into effectively a year-long review now.
You didn't say how you'd fund it, Luke.
A year-long review of how, of what's going to happen from that. I think that's possibly too long. I was pleased to see that John Healey went out there and made more commitments, because I think that's really, really important. But these are the hard questions that are going to have to come out for the Labour Party to make that choice. Unfortunately, we're seeing either quango or review. Politician safety, let's have a review. Defence, let's have a review.
But do you accept there wasn't a review? You didn't say how it would be funded at any point.
We said there'd be 75 billion by the 2030. And yes, civil service cuts, for example, was one of the ways.
They were going to meet all of that, were they?
No, absolutely not. But that was part of the way it was structured in how to get there. But we've lost that argument, so it's over to Labour to make sure they have an argument, because I want this country to succeed and, more importantly, Ukraine to succeed.
Do you accept then, Preet, that if there is a Trump presidency and Vance as the vice president, that a Labour government may have to get to that 2.5% quicker than perhaps it might have thought?
Yeah, look, I mean, Keir's made it very clear security is really important given what's going on in Ukraine and much more broader. And the hollowing out of the armed forces under the Conservatives is a real big concern. This review will look at areas that we need to absolutely be putting more support. But like I said, there's been a lot of wastage. But the commitment for the 2.5% is there. But we will be absolutely responsible setting out how we will fund it, not like the Conservatives, making a commitment, no idea as to how they're going to fund any of that. That's why they're not in government now.
Right, just very briefly, Henry, the Daily Telegraph headline here, Armed Forces needs revamp to take on deadly quartet, says review chief. This is the ex-NATO boss, Lord Robertson, telling Labour that the UK must adapt to threats posed by China, Iran, Russia and North Korea. That's going to focus minds too, isn't it?
Yes, sort of, but in a way it also unfocuses minds, because those are four different threats that require very different responses. If you want to have a military ready for confronting Russia and Eastern Europe, that needs a completely different defence posture to something involving Iran or China, which would focus on a blue water navy.
So the review might be worthwhile in that sense.
Well, what's happened since the end of the Cold War is, under all parties, is that defence spending has continually fallen without any government making an honest decision about whether it wants to have a land-focused strategy or a Navy-focused strategy. We've tried to do everything with not enough money, and as a result, everything is not really working.
Now, the King's speech will take place tomorrow. At the heart of it will be legislation to create Great British Energy, which is part of the new government's plans to make the UK a clean energy superpower. Now, Labour has an ambitious target of 100% of UK electricity production to be generated by renewables by 2030. The Tories had a target time of 2035. Now, one of the key obstacles to meeting the 2030 target is the challenge of upgrading the UK's electricity grid network. Let's talk to Dr. Sugandha Srivastav of Oxford University's Smith School of Enterprise and Environment. Welcome to you. Just briefly, what is the grid and why do we need to expand it?
Well, the grid is a very important piece of infrastructure because it's what helps electrons go from where they're generated to households and businesses. And one of the reasons we need to expand it is because a lot of renewable energy is located in the north. Think of your Scottish offshore wind farms, and a lot of where electricity is consumed is down south. So we need to expand the grid and ease up congestion along one of those main north to south transmission lines.
Do we know how much, in a sort of ballpark figure, it'll cost?
Well, there's different cost estimates, but let me lay out the thinking here. There's three ways we can approach this problem. One is we can build out more transmission. Two, we can build more grid-scale batteries to store renewable electricity. And three, we can also move demand because if consumers can move demand from peak times to off-peak, then that actually reduces the pressure to build these pylons. So in terms of what the total cost estimate is, it really depends on the strategy of how we balance across these three options.
But are the plans achievable?
Yes, I think the plans are achievable. If we look at the past, from 2012, the UK had 38% of coal on its grid, and 8 years later, that went down to 2%. So rapid transformation is absolutely possible and has already been done by this country. So I think that from a technical perspective, this is doable. We'll need to get the politics right.
Ah, right. Well, let's talk about the political aspect of it, Sugandha. Is the government likely to face significant political opposition to these plans, in whatever form they take?
Well, I think getting the messaging correct is absolutely key. So after Russia invaded Ukraine, gas prices went through the roof, and that resulted in unprecedented increases in household electricity bills. Now, it is a fact that solar and wind provide the cheapest electricity in the UK, and this can really help affordability. So there is a moment to capitalize on this narrative and to say that building transmission and battery storage is all part of bringing the cheapest electricity to households. It's absolutely critical that we nail this narrative because it is the narrative that is backed by the data.
Thank you very much, Dr. Srivastav, for joining us. How are you going to achieve it? Listening to what you just heard Sugandha say, how are you going to achieve it by 2030?
Right, so look, this is the start. Great British Energy is about creating competition into the grid. This is about cheap, homegrown renewables. At the moment, you cannot get a space on the grid for 15 years. The government have got a backlog of new technologies, of different ways. You know, we've already lifted the ban on onshore wind. That's the very first thing that we have done. So this is something we don't have a choice. We have to do it if we want to bring bills down. We want to have energy security, and we will create good jobs by doing this.
Yes, and this is all the campaign stuff that we heard. But just to be clear to our viewers, Preet, it is going to involve something like 1,000 miles of power lines and pylons. This was actually to get there by 2035, so I mean, you're going to have to speed it up. Or 400 miles of undersea cables. The National Grid's electricity systems operator said it would be at a cost of £60 billion to upgrade to electricity being totally renewable by 2030. How's that going to happen?
Look, first thing is that you've got to have planning proposals put in place, and so there will be the normal consultation. This is not going to be something we force on anybody, especially farmers, for example. This will have to be done with consent. And as you say, there is underground cabling. We've got to look at the cost factor of that as a, you know, and pylons. But this essentially is about how do we get the electricity to businesses and into homes. This is a big challenge. We've had Conservatives that have done nothing. We've been reliant on foreign dictators for our energy security, and we need to make a shift and transition to that.
Henry?
I mean, the reason the Conservatives have done nothing is because they have refused time and again to force people to build stuff they don't want to do, which is exactly what you're saying you'll do now. Ultimately, the problem with our planning system is that it is riddled with local vetoes, and local people often have very different cost-benefit analyses to the country. The test for essential infrastructure, of which pylons is part, should not be whether local people want it, it should be whether the nation needs it, and central government should have the will to drive it through. And if you're not prepared to do that, you're not going to deliver anything like the amount of cabling required.
We will deliver that, but of course we've got to explain to the British public why we need to do it. Unfortunately, previously, people haven't just really understood how the grid works, why our electricity and gas is so expensive. Look, absolutely. You're talking about need. We have got to do this. We do not have a choice in the matter, especially when we think about climate. The Greens have, the co-leader of the Greens has been objecting to a lot of these renewable projects, where nobody knows actually what the Greens actually support, to be honest. But yes, we will. There is a clear plan and strategy that Ed Miliband has together about how we achieve this.
Right. Well, Carla, you say that isn't quite true. It is true. So one of the people that Henry is talking about when he says that local people have a different view, one of those local people is your new Green MP, Adrian Ramsey. He's called for a pause in terms of building power lines that would go through his constituency. Now, you're the Green Party. If there was ever not in my backyard, that's it.
It is absolutely in the DNA of the Greens to push for a more rapid rollout of renewables. That is literally...
Including pylons and power lines across his constituency.
My co-leader, Adrian, newly elected, hard-working MP, has rightly been making sure that the people in his constituency have a chance to have their voice heard in the ongoing public consultation.
So has he failed to communicate the message possibly at a Green MP?
That's quite right. But both he and I have previously worked in the renewable energy sector. In my case, I've literally gone into politics because I used to work in offshore wind, and I saw that the barrier to the rapid rollout isn't the technology, as we've just heard from the expert there, it's the political will. And on the grid specifically, if I may, I would argue that part of the reason that the grid hasn't been invested in and built out earlier, because really the time this needed to happen was decades ago, not now, is in part because the national grid is privatised, and so they didn't have that public mandate to invest in the system decades ahead before... Because we've now got renewable energy projects
So you're going to object to it now, even though a pylon in this constituency, and Adrian Ramsey, constituency in particular, is going to carry that electricity from the offshore wind to parts of the country that's needed.
I have to pick up on what you said there. Adrian Ramsey is not opposing all pylons, and the Green Party...
I didn't say all. I said the one in his constituency.
There's so much more in Britain where pylons can go.
So, to clarify, my colleague Adrian is challenging particular aspects of the route
his constituency.
And suggesting that, may I just finish, that parts of the route should be undergrounded in ecologically sensitive areas.
How much is that going to cost?
Which the National Grid has already done in some areas in response to first rounds of the feedback, and he's helping constituents to have their voices heard on the impacts on the local area, which I think is
underground is 5 times as much.
I've read 10 times,
and
but
so
look, you know...
for certain parts of the route, even if it's not the whole thing, I think is worth considering.
Right, OK, well, maybe it is worth considering. Luke, you support, I presume, the plans by the Labour government, the ambition of it, and their commitment to saying no.
Well, I've got an insight into this, having spent the PPS in BEIS and then in Energy and Net Zero. So I've heard these debates go on, and it's very interesting. I think both Labour and the Greens are going to get a rude awakening when they are put there, but as MPs, to say, would you have solar panels in, Edgbaston Golf Club, for example, where I trained? It's very hard then for you to turn around to your public and say, well, it's for the greater good. There has to be a balance on this, and that's why I'm quite excited to see what comes forward. We put forward the energy security bill that has now gone into place, but I'm quite keen to see what GB Energy actually looks like and what a wealth fund actually looks like, because we're still not really clear. Does it make any energy? What's the risk profile on this wealth fund that's going to be there? Who's going to carry the can?
You ought to read the briefings, in all honesty. But this idea that somehow in Birmingham, Edgbaston, they wouldn't expect a solar panel, say, on a green field, that is incorrect, because most people understand understand that they want their bills to come down. They want energy security, and we have to look at green spaces where you can do dual things.
The argument made by the co-leader of the Greens in his local party is about what about food security, what about the rural environment, what about the traffic, what about the community. This is the difficult part, and government is to make a choice. And Henry's right here. These are really, really difficult issues to try and work out.
And ones that Conservatives failed to actually grapple with because of vested interests.
Hang on, you did hear from Shiganda saying that actually we've managed to make a significant change over the last 8 years. We are the fastest decarbonising side, but country in the world. But the infrastructure side is fundamental. And we've just been talking about defence and wanting to spend more there, but trying to argue 10 years ago
you had no idea how to do this. The National Wealth Fund that we are talking about is £1 of investment. We will want £3
So what's the risk profile
from the
for
private
it?
sector.
Are we seeing
There's been no stability for businesses to bring in investment.
Talk to each other, don't talk over each other if you can.
I'm really keen to see. So it's not a wealth fund in the sense of what Norway have set out, but what's the risk profile to the taxpayer? How much do they expect to get up? Because from what I gather, it's supposed to be an investment on the riskier part. So how much of a hit? And you've put it out to a quango. It's not the minister himself.
Come on. Well, there are lots of questions, but the broad question, if you don't mind me summarising, is bills will have to go up, won't they, in the short term, to pay for this, and then bills might come down in 10 years' time.
No, I don't. You
don't think bills will have to go up at all?
No. The National Wealth Fund is about, we will invest £1 and we will ask £3 investment from private sector. Why is that important? The private sector hasn't had the stability it needs from this government, from the last government, in order to bring about the investment. So how do we get our ports renewable ready? How do we invest in hydrogen? How do we have the gigafactories that Labour has already made commitments to? How do we invest in the steel industry? These are all really important investment projects, decarbonising those industrial hubs. Well, this is exactly what's needed. I mean, none of this
it may be what's needed, but it is about whether or not you will be able to drive through opposition, the sort of opposition that we've been talking about. I mean, just broadly,
Carl, given that Labour have rolled back on their investment pledge. I mean, let's not forget, this is the party who rolled back on their 28 billion climate investment pledge.
But you'd still be opposing some infrastructure.
Your co-leader is objecting to pylons in his constituency. I mean, goodness me, what we have is a very clear plan about how do we get energy security. At the moment, we are reliant on foreign dictators. The government sold off gas storage, and at the moment, we're paying 62 million a day because the grid can't actually cope with capacity. This is dire. So actually, what we are going to do will address a lot of these issues.
And I'm interested to see what happens with Great British Energy. It could be a really important part of the solution. But if you're going to massively cut investment in climate action, which is what the Labour Party did before it even got into power, how are you going to fund that? The 28 billion that was your policy was already the floor of what was needed. And we know that the sooner we invest in reducing carbon emissions, the cheaper it is for government. The later we leave it, the more it costs.
If Labour's really serious about this, it should make GB Energy a planning authority with the power to give itself planning permission. That would allow it to deliver everything it wanted and take all of the politicians and their local concerns out of the equation. I don't think it is clear, because you started the spiel for Great British Energy saying it wasn't something you were going to force on people, and then within 2 minutes were saying that you were. And it's important that you do. We really do need to force infrastructure through. I think the easiest thing for politicians to do normally is to try and build stuff in the bits of the country that vote for other people. It's absolutely extraordinary that the Conservatives didn't manage to build Abingdon Reservoir. Large parts of the southwest have avoidable drought. But the problem is always planning. The private sector has been trying to build Abingdon. It has been trying to build a lot of projects. You can't bring forward that investment unless you offer them security of planning. And you cannot offer security of planning if you have an extended process with a local veto where a single project can fall at any point of an expensive multi-year pitch process.
Right, but
so
Henry,
unless you offer those guarantees, it won't happen.
But Henry, do you think Dr. Shiganda is right that because of the experience of spiking energy prices and therefore people's bills, that might soften up some opposition to having the sorts of infrastructure that we've been talking about?
I mean, it might, and that would be wonderful, but just historically it hasn't. We've tried, energy development projects, pylons have tried offering local people lower bills as part of an incentive process for approval, and it has never worked. Sadly, the fact is, if you can get people to agree to it, it's ideal. And there are things you can do. You could try and make the pylons prettier, they're hideous. You could try and make them part of the landscape in more way, but ultimately, you need to have the will as central government to say this, the nation needs this, and we are going to do it, even if that leaves some people
can I agree with you on that?
Right.
I mean, the final point I would make, the cross-government working will ensure that, because, of course, it's different departments working together to understand why this is important and why it's important in certain areas, and being able to then communicate that. And that's exactly what will happen. Keir's very clear that that's how he's going to drive a lot of the missions, is those cross-government departments.
Well, let's just pick up on something that you were asked, Carla, during the election campaign in terms of leading from the front. Here's the Times headline: "Yes, I have a gas boiler, but I plan to replace it," says Greens co-leader. Carla Denyer said she was getting quotes for a heat pump but had to delay the installation until after the election. Have you accepted any of the quotes that are in your inbox?
I haven't been back in Bristol a great deal over the last few days, but yes, I have now got a couple of quotes for an installation of a heat pump. Looking forward to finding some time to get that done, perhaps in the recess.
Right, we'll come back to it when you're next on the programme. Ahead of tomorrow's King's speech, of course, we'll be setting out all sorts of legislation and bills in terms of the government's agenda. But Labour is under pressure from some of its own backbench MPs to scrap the two-child benefits cap. Deputy Prime Minister Angela Rayner was asked about it on Breakfast. Let's have a listen to part of her interview.
Well, I accept that people are frustrated and want to, change a lot of things that the Conservatives have done over the last 14 years, but our inheritance is dire. As someone who grew up in poverty, I am not prepared to leave office, after a Labour government where we haven't made those significant changes, and child poverty is an issue for us, and we're absolutely appalled that children haven't got beds to sleep in at night. This is the 21st century. This shouldn't be the situation we're in, but this is the inheritance that the Conservatives have left us, and we will continue to tackle those issues.
Preet, is that really good enough in terms of not scrapping the two-child benefits cap?
Look, no one policy is going to lift children out of poverty.
That one does actually lift quite a few out of poverty, according to all sorts of think tanks.
OK, but, we've got a Child Health Action Plan where we're talking about making sure we've got Breakfast Club investment, because we know having a, good start to the day is really, really important. Children not having hungry bellies, for example. And our offer in terms of childcare, making sure that more people can go back into work so they can have more money in their pockets, and making sure that childcare is affordable.
So you think it's right to keep it?
I think it's right that when the economy grows that we absolutely review it, because I'm not going to make an unfunded commitment today. Nobody, the British public, would not expect me to sit here and say, yes, we're going to deliver it, without me telling you how we're going to pay for it.
Right, well, why did you then, in February 2020, you were one of 78 Labour MPs who signed a letter calling on the then Prime Minister and Chancellor to, among other things, end the two-child limit in universal credit?
Well, absolutely. But look, the economic situation is much more difficult now. What we've inherited, given the Conservatives, I mean, goodness me, we will not make any commitment on any policy without saying how we actually are going to pay for it. Now, look, there are 20% of children in my constituency that live in poverty. Closing down children's centres, decimation of early years services, places where actually they could get support, advice, all of that has been stripped away. Local government funding cuts to charities. Sure. This all has an impact.
Right, and you obviously thought it was affordable then, but yes, that was 2020. It's very much the Conservatives who have come to this situation with all the litany of woes that have just been listed by Preet. Do you agree?
Well, I'm trying to think if this is what it is. We'll see lots of these over the next promises that were made over 14 years that suddenly actually become quite difficult to deliver. I would argue there's an opportunity
because
cost.
of mismanagement by you?
No, not at all. No, different choices. So, for example, in 2021, we decided to change the UC taper rate and uplift it from £500 and change the UC taper from 63% to 55%. And that cost £2 billion. But actually, that gave more working people £1,000 a year better. I, for one, think that's a better way of using the £2 to £3 billion that the child benefit cap puts in place. These are options that are going to be tested. And Keir's going to have a real tough time if these come to the surface, because you will see them time and time again. People re-quoted stuff they've said, promises they've made that they'll want to see that then don't come through.
You've had 14 years. Yeah. We've had 14
Absolutely. I've just given you a cast iron example.
Carla, you would like to see it scrapped, wouldn't you?
I would. The two-child benefit cap is a cruel and unnecessary policy that affects 1.6 million children in this country. Lifting it isn't even that expensive. expensive. It's the same order of magnitude as the cost of the fuel duty freeze. And I know where I would rather spend my money, lifting 250,000 children out of poverty. That's a choice the Labour government could take. It's choosing not to.
Well, Conservative Home, the Conservatives should support a Labour revolt over the 2-child limit. Join the Greens, join some Labour MPs and the SNP.
Yeah, my colleague William wrote that, and you can ask him for his reasons.
But you don't agree?
I don't think that the 2-child limit should have been brought in. The reason that George Osborne managed to get away with it is because it felt for many fundamentally unfair that working households had to make really, really difficult decisions about whether or not they could afford a second child or a third child, and people on welfare who their taxes were paying for didn't have to face it. Now, the 2-child limit was the wrong way to deal with that. I think that we should actually have far more support for people trying to have families in general. But at the moment, you will have to ask William for his views on that policy.
All right. Well, hello, William. Come on next time. That's all we have time for. Thank you to all of my guests for joining me today, and I'll be back tomorrow at 12:15. Bye-bye.